I want to start with a number. 4 billion. Not $4 billion, not 4 billion years. 4 billion living trees growing across a stretch of the eastern United States larger than most European countries. 40 years later, functionally, none of them were left standing. They weren't burned. They weren't logged into oblivion by some industrial empire. They were killed by something almost nobody saw coming and almost nobody could stop once it arrived. The story of how it happened is stranger and more devastating than almost anything else in American environmental history. And yet I'd bet most people watching this have never heard it. Picture the eastern forests before 1900. Not a metaphor, an actual physical reality. In parts of the Appalachians, roughly 1 in 4 trees you looked at was an American chestnut. In some stretches, it was closer to 1 in 2. These weren't small trees either. Chestnuts routinely grew over 100 feet tall, with trunks so wide that early accounts describe hollowed-out stumps big enough for a family to shelter inside during a storm. Foresters called it the perfect tree, and that wasn't just poetry. The wood was straight-grained, lightweight, and resistant to rot, which made it the default material for cabins, barns, fence posts, telephone poles, and railroad ties across the entire eastern half of the country. And every autumn the tree did something no other tree in the forest could match at that scale. It dropped food, an enormous, reliable, sweet, edible harvest, year after year without anyone planting a single seed. This is hard to picture now because nothing today replaces it. Farmers turned their hogs and cattle loose in chestnut forests every fall to fatten them on the fallen nuts, free, with no feed required. Families filled baskets by the dozens, roasted what they needed, and shipped the rest. Late 19th century newspapers describe entire railroad cars packed to the roof with chestnuts rolling into New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore to be sold fresh on street corners for the holidays. Rural households with almost no cash income still had a reliable source of both food and trade goods because the tree simply gave it to them. Indigenous communities throughout Appalachia had relied on the same trees for centuries before that, grinding the nuts into flour, stewing them, and actively managing the land around them to encourage chestnut growth. This wasn't some curiosity at the edge of the forest. It was infrastructure, a tree that fed people, fed livestock, and built houses without asking anyone's permission or labor to keep producing. In the summer of 1904, a gardener at the Bronx Zoo in New York was doing his normal rounds when he noticed something wrong with a handful of the park's chestnut trees, strange orange-yellow patches forming on the bark, with the branches above them dying back. He brought in a mycologist, William Merle, to figure out what was going on. Merle found a fungus never before recorded on American soil. It entered a tree through the smallest wound or crack in the bark, then grew in a ring around the trunk or branch, cutting off the flow of water and nutrients until everything above the ring died. The fungus had almost certainly arrived a few years earlier on Japanese chestnut nursery stock imported for ornamental planting. Asian chestnut species had evolved alongside this fungus for millions of years and built up resistance to it. American chestnuts, which had never encountered it before in their evolutionary history, had no defense at all. And then it just started moving, not slowly. The fungus spread by wind-blown spores and by rain, insects, and birds that carried it further. It advanced outward from New York at a documented rate of roughly 50 miles a year, about 200 miles a decade, and cut a widening front southward and westward through the entire natural range of the tree. In the early years, well-funded quarantine efforts cut down healthy trees ahead of the infection front, a desperate attempt to create a fire break the fungus couldn't cross. It didn't work. The spores traveled too far and too easily. They rode wind currents, animal fur, and the boots of the very workers trying to contain them. By the outbreak of the First World War, funding for chestnut blight research had largely dried up as money shifted to the war effort, and whatever remained of organized resistance to the disease collapsed. Foresters in the Appalachians describe watching, almost helplessly, as the blight arrived in their region through the 1920s and swept south. One period account put it about as plainly as it can be put: the blight never met a tree it couldn't kill. The timeline is the part that should genuinely stop you. A tree that had dominated the eastern forest canopy for millions of years, survived the last ice age, and coexisted with humans for the entire span of human presence on this continent, was reduced to a functional ghost of itself in under 50 years. Not war, not deforestation for agriculture, not climate collapse. A single fungal introduction that nobody intended and almost nobody even noticed until it was already unstoppable. By the end of the 1940s, somewhere around 80% of American chestnuts across the eastern U.S. were dead or actively dying. Estimates place the total loss at somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion mature trees. If you could have taken every chestnut alive in 1904 and clustered them together, some estimates suggest they'd have covered roughly 9 million acres of solid, unbroken chestnut forest. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find even one. A tree that used to define entire mountain ranges is, by most practical measures, gone from the landscape it once ruled. The strangest part of the story, the part that turns this from a sad historical footnote into something closer to a horror story, is that the chestnut isn't actually extinct. Not technically. The blight fungus kills the part of the tree above ground, but it doesn't reach the root system. So all across the Appalachians today, there are still hundreds of millions of chestnut root systems alive underground, and every so often a new shoot pushes up out of one of those old root collars, trying again. It grows for a handful of years, sometimes long enough to flower, almost never long enough to produce nuts, and then the blight, which never actually left the ecosystem, finds it and kills it back down to the root. And then it tries again. This has been happening in an endless, silent loop for roughly a century. Scientists estimate there are still upwards of 400 million of these root sprouts scattered through eastern forests right now, each one a genetic echo of a tree species that used to feed a continent, dying young over and over, generation after generation, without anyone noticing unless they know exactly what they're looking at. This isn't extinction so much as a permanent invisible amputation, repeating itself in the understory of forests that millions of people walk through every year without any idea what they're looking at. The economic and cultural aftershock of the blight was just as severe as the ecological one, and it's mostly been forgotten too. Entire regional industries had been built around chestnut wood and chestnut tannin, used in leather production, and some of the largest timber operations in Appalachia were structured specifically around chestnut supply. When the trees died, those industries didn't gently decline. They collapsed, taking local economies with them. Families who had relied on the autumn chestnut harvest as a genuine, unpaid source of food security lost it within a single generation. The tree had even become a symbol in American folklore and children's literature, standing for abundance, patience, and the idea of a reliable natural inheritance. That entire cultural relationship, built up over centuries, essentially vanished within the working lifetime of a single person. Someone could be born into a world where the chestnut harvest was as dependable as the seasons themselves, and die in a world where their own grandchildren had never seen a mature chestnut tree standing in a forest. What gets me most going through the record on this is how quiet the whole catastrophe actually was in the broader historical memory. This wasn't a war, an earthquake, or a famine with a body count attached directly to human lives. It was a fungus on tree bark, and because the primary casualties were trees rather than people, it never got etched into public memory the way other disasters of the same era did. But by scale and speed, this ranks among the most severe ecological catastrophes ever recorded on this continent, arguably the fastest large-scale extinction event in the modern historical record for a dominant forest species, and most people alive today have simply never been told it happened. There is at least a real second act. Since the 1980s, an organization called the American Chestnut Foundation has run a long, patient breeding program that crosses surviving American chestnuts with blight-resistant Chinese chestnuts across multiple generations, trying to combine American form with Asian resistance. More recently, researchers at the State University of New York went further and genetically engineered an American chestnut variety, nicknamed Darling 58, that carries a single added gene borrowed from wheat. That gene lets the tree detoxify the compound the fungus uses to kill it. Field trials are underway now, planting these trees back into the Appalachian range they used to define, to see whether the species can come back after 120 years of near-total defeat. The whole story leaves you with an uncomfortable question. If a tree that fed an entire continent's worth of people and animals for thousands of years could be reduced to root sprouts within 50 years, by an accident nobody intended, what does that tell you about how permanent the abundance around you really is? We tend to assume the natural systems we grew up with are just how things are and always will be. The chestnut forest was exactly that assumption for millions of people for hundreds of years, and then it wasn't. Somewhere under the forest floor near you right now, there might be a root system a century old, still trying.